Why, hello. No. Not all of my lights are on. Okay. What's happening? God, I've just been reading all morning. I have to do more reading, but live. Do you understand? Do you understand what my job is? Tutor, Matthew, Bob / John. Those are two very ordinary names you have there. So what are we doing? Are we going to read this whole fucking report? Maybe, maybe not. Wealth taxes. We all love wealth taxes. Since the dawn of time, we have loved wealth taxes, but can they work? Who knows? Okay. Last time we did go through some stuff about a wealth tax. Commissioned by the Brazilian G20 presidency. Mate, Brazil are on one at the moment. They're like, they're really, they're going in a good direction, Brazil. They're starting to pull their weight internationally as well. Because it's a fucking massive country. They jailed Bolsonaro, you know, he's going to die. Looking forward to that day. We can celebrate it all together. Morally earned wealth instead of wealth taxes. Well, I would say that wealth taxes are one way of achieving that aim. I don't know, morally earned wealth. I mean, it sounds like a... I don't think anybody could disagree with that, though, right? So I guess wealth taxes are one of the tools for achieving that. The governor was with Mamdani campaigning for her, and while she was on stage, the crowd chanted "Tax the rich." Nice. Yeah, he's big on it. Zach Polanski in the UK is big on it. Is the stream going to be uploaded? Well, it stays on the playlists of this channel. They all stay on the playlist of this channel if you look through 2025 streams, for instance. But I won't re-upload the whole thing. I'll probably clip it if there's anything good. Who knows? Who knows if there'll be anything good in it? Probably not. I mean, it is one of my streams after all. Taxing the wealthy, Bastani, Waldenstrom taxing our wealth. Well, I'm on this one. Those do sound worth looking at. Wait, let me copy the... Maybe another time. It's not going to be a long stream today, so I'll be 2021. Oh. Wealth and capital income taxation. Okay. Both of these do look very good. They're proper economics papers. No, none of this woke nonsense. But I'm going to stick to this one now. I want to finish because with Zucman, I mean, I've read some short papers by him and articles. I've watched a lecture by him and I thought it was good. But I was like, I need to read like a full report by him. And towards the end of the last stream, I just like stumbled across this one. I was like, oh right, this is it. Forward. If someone paid all their employees well, including benefits, do you still need a wealth tax? I think so. People who play... Okay, so here's an example. Taylor Swift pays her employees pretty well. Like, she's one of the few kind of billionaires, famous people. And, yes, I am a Taylor Swift fan. I hold my hands up and say I am. But You don't. I looked it up. I tried to search for it, and you just don't see. All of her former employees are like, "Oh, it was great working for her." Do we still need to tax her wealth? Absolutely. I think that just so here's what I like about a wealth tax. So I hear where you're coming from, Ecovian. You're talking about pre-distribution in a sense, and there was this paper recently in the Journal of Economic Literature about how the Scandinavian, not sure if it was Scandinavian or Nordic, I think it was Scandinavian social democracies, they actually achieved most of their income equality through pre-distribution, not redistribution, as is commonly thought. So their taxation system, their taxes are generally higher, and it is a progressive system, but it's not as progressive as people think. A lot of their rich, like in most places, don't actually pay that much tax, but their pre-tax income is lower, and crucially, the pre-tax income of the poor and middle class is higher in Scandinavian countries. So I do agree with pre-distribution. However, like I said, there's still quite a lot of inequality in these countries. And the thing about a wealth tax or any tax is that it's quite a simple tool for whatever causes the inequality, whether you're talking about some kind of gross exploitation or injustice, sweatshops or things like that, environmental dumping, fraud and corruption, right? Whether you're talking about something like that, whether you're talking about the more general sense in which capitalism just tends to create inequality, which is that basically it's winner take all. So, you know, the biggest firms and their owners and managers tend to get a bigger slice of the pie. Whether you're talking about that kind of general market mechanism for inequality, or whether you're talking about, you know, political mechanisms for inequality as well, whether you're talking about like people in the government just getting rich. Whatever it is, it could be caused by anything. And there are so many of these different things, right? Intellectual property laws, right? Favor the wealthy. Yeah, you can talk about gradually abolishing or reforming each one of those, and I'm pro that. But if you've got high taxes, you know, you're going to funnel it back to people. Am I more interested in the feasibility or the moral justification? The feasibility. Oh, I pronounced it right. Excellent. That's a first for this channel. Zucman is French, so there is already decent worker protection, but wealth concentration is still an issue. Yeah, like, totally. And I do think going back to Taylor Swift, as is my want, she is like the perfect billionaire in a sense that, like, I might make a video about this one day to, one, kind of wind people up, and two, try and attract the Swifties, which is quite a big audience. But like a lot of Taylor Swift's money comes from people essentially paying her for her music. Now, it is expensive, and you could rethink that. But she actually doesn't. She was the first billionaire solely through her music. Right, so Rihanna was a billionaire before Taylor Swift, but she had a line of like products, like makeup especially. And other musicians, I forget who, had like basically merch. Taylor Swift did it like literally just through people paying her for her music. And I feel like that's just the inequality of the market system. It's like Robert Nozick's example, where he's like, everybody gives, it was Wilt Chamberlain, a basketball player at the time, a famous basketball player. Everybody pays money to see them, and therefore all of the money that the thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people that go to see them pay goes basically to them, or a big proportion of it goes to the players or the managers or the owners of the stadium, right? And he says, well, that was all voluntary, so what's the problem? Now, that's his libertarian angle. But what I'm saying is, even that kind of fairly free market situation can result in inequality through that exact mechanism. And so if we think inequality causes problems, then we think that we need to tax even in that situation, even when there was not really that much exploitation. The private jet thing is definitely a mark against Taylor Swift, although she did sell her second private jet after there was outrage. But yeah, yeah. There's not really too much defending that. The amount she uses it, whether it's one or two. All right, your Taylor Swift puns are noted and enjoyed, Crystal Maiden Punk. All right, let's start actually reading this. Stop talking about Taylor Swift. Otherwise, the stream will just go on for ages. Forever. In February 2024, the group of 20 under the presidency of Brazil convened a meeting of finance ministers during which the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals and its lack of effectiveness were discussed. The G20 Brazilian presidency invited me to discuss the reasons behind this issue and how enhanced international cooperation could contribute to fixing it. Following this meeting, the Brazilian presidency commissioned this report to explore options and make the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals more effective. There are, of course, many policies that countries can implement to improve the taxation of the wealthiest individuals, but international coordination on this issue, in the form of a common minimum standard ensuring an effective taxation of ultra net worth individuals, would have a clear value added. It would support domestic policies to bolster tax progressivity by reducing incentives for the wealthiest individuals to engage in tax avoidance and by curtailing the forces of tax competition. It could contribute to ushering in a new era of multilateralism that would put at its core the fight against inequality and coordination across nations to foster equitable growth. The G20 has been a driver of international tax reforms over the past decade. Thanks to the leadership of the G20, more than 130 countries and territories have agreed to a common minimum corporate tax for large multinational companies in 2021. Hell yeah! What we have collectively done with multinational corporations, we could in principle now do with billionaires. Building on past successes, this report shows that it has become technically possible to implement a coordinated minimum tax on ultra-high net worth individuals. The goal of this blueprint is to offer a basis for political discussions to start a conversation, not to end it. It is for citizens to decide, through democratic deliberation and the vote, how taxation should be carried out. I hope this report will contribute to this democratic discussion. Blah, 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 blah. I might actually steal your puns for the Taylor Swift video, CMP. Progressive taxation is a key pillar of democratic societies. A progressive tax system strengthens social cohesion and trust in governments to work for the common good. It is critical to fund the public goods and services such as education, healthcare, and public infrastructure that are engines of economic growth. Changes in the progressivity of taxation have historically been a major driver of the evolution of income and wealth concentration. There you go. So that kind of answers your question a bit, Yakovian. Taxes are just so important. Well, hello, Wizard of Lizard. Thanks for subscribing, but following, whatever. Thanks to research conducted in recent years, there is now clear evidence that contemporary tax systems, instead of being progressive, do not effectively tax the wealthiest individuals. These studies, summarised in Section 1 of this report, show that all taxes included, ultra-high net worth individuals tend to pay less in tax relative to their income than other social groups, regardless of the specific tax design choices and enforcement practices of countries. This regressivity stems from the failure of income taxes, which in principle constitute the main instrument of tax progressivity, to effectively tax ultra-high net worth individuals. How many times are we going to end up saying that? Fuck me. Ultra-high net worth individuals. UHNWIs. If he were American, if Zucman were American, he would have made an acronym. Ultra-high worth individuals, USHWI. I don't know. This failure deprives governments of substantial amounts of tax revenues. It contributes to concentrating the gains of globalization into relatively few hands, undermining the social sustainability of global economic integration. Meanwhile, under the impetus of the G20, there have been improvements in international tax cooperation since the mid-2010s. In 2017, more than 100 countries and territories started exchanging bank data automatically following a common reporting standard. In 2021, more than 130 jurisdictions agreed to a common minimum tax of 15% on large multinational companies. While these policies have limitations, they also show that new forms of international cooperation, long deemed utopian, could emerge in a relatively short period of time. Building on these advances, it has become possible to make the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals more effective through international cooperation. So this is really important. He said this in a talk that I watched the other day. It was on my gaming stream, so it wasn't on the main channel. But if you remember the Panama Papers and how all of the wealth, all of the tax avoidance and evasion practices of the ultra wealthy were revealed, and then it seemed like nothing happened, and certainly not enough happened. Tax authorities have actually been making progress on this. Despite it's funny, isn't it? Because it's like, if you ignore, like, I don't know, I guess this is what Trump would call the deep state, but sometimes I just think, like, man, should we just selectively ignore big P politics? Because it's like, if this was happening just because tax experts and civil servants and activists and journalists were pushing for this exchange of information, and computer scientists, computing specialists, all of the people designing and implementing these systems were actually pushing for better integration of international taxation. They're putting the infrastructure in place for this kind of stuff. But quietly, like, I didn't know about this before I read Zucman. Section 2 details a proposal for a coordinated minimum standard ensuring that dollar billionaires pay at least 2% of their wealth in individual income plus wealth taxes each year. Okay, so that's total. Okay. This standard would not require a multilateral treaty and could be flexibly implemented by participating countries through a variety of domestic instruments, including a presumptive income tax, an income tax on a broad notion of income, or a wealth tax. A minimum tax equal to 2% of wealth on global billionaires would raise $200 to $250 billion per year in tax revenue from about 3,000 taxpayers globally. Extending the tax to centimillionaires would generate an additional 100 to 140 billion. By construction, these revenues would be collected from economic actors who are both very wealthy and undertaxed today. Someone who pays more than 2% of their wealth in income tax would have no extra tax liability. Only ultra-high net worth individuals with particularly low tax payments would be affected. So they're trying to integrate it so that you pay out of... Hey! I thought this was supposed to be plugged in. Alright. 1 second, everyone. far as I'm concerned, that light is plugged in, but it seems to think that it isn't. Is it working now? It's working too well. Seeing stars. Hello, everybody. Beyond the revenue gains for governments, there would be benefits in terms of increased social trust and cohesion. Variations over the baseline scenario also explored. The international standard would not substitute for domestic tax policies to increase tax progressivity. Instead, as analysed in Section 3, it would complement and facilitate such policies because it would improve transparency about top-end wealth, reduce incentives for ultra-high net worth individuals to engage in tax avoidance, and constrain international tax competition, preventing a race to the bottom. Okay, so here's the challenges. What happened? My light went out, my streamer light. It looked plugged in, but then it just wasn't. You know how it be. The capital flight. Well, I think we're going to learn about capital flight. The journalist who reported on the Panama Papers got blown up in a car bomb and it wasn't reported in any media. Yeah. Is that true? Daphne, Maltese writer, assassination by a car bomb. Mate, she should have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Interesting. A car bomb. Is there any progress? Life imprisonment for those who supplied it. Oh yeah, okay, so there are, yeah. People have been prosecuted, but who knows? I can't remember who said it, but somebody said the best reward for good journalism is death. Right, so let's get into this. There are several potential challenges associated with the proposal formulated in this blueprint. How to value wealth. How to ensure an effective taxation if some jurisdictions decline to implement this standard. How to maximise compliance by taxpayers. Section 4 analyses these challenges and discusses potential solutions. The world is in a better situation to successfully implement the proposal made in this blueprint today than 15 years ago. Challenges remain, however. Two issues require particular attention. These reports aren't exactly gripping reading. I doubt we'll read it like word for word. First, there are still gaps in international information exchange and identification of the beneficial owners of assets. These issues could be tackled by adding beneficial ownership information to the country-by-country reports of multinational companies introduced in 2016 and by creating new forms of cross-border information exchange on ultra-high net worth individuals. Since the bulk of billionaires' wealth derives from owning shares in multinational companies, the mere inclusion of beneficial ownership information in country-by-country reports, like listing individuals owning more than 1% of the stock, would allow tax authorities to capture most of their wealth, facilitating enforcement. That idea of like most of your wealth being in shares, like notional wealth, it's actually not. I don't want to get my terms mixed up. It doesn't matter, but it's like it's not real, right? So there's different ways of taxing stock wealth. Second, a variety of political and geopolitical factors could make it difficult to obtain truly global participation in the proposed common standard. The report discusses possible approaches to limit incentives for ultra-high net worth individuals to relocate to non-participating countries, as well as rules to incentivize broad participation. One option involves adapting some of the tax collector of last resort mechanisms included in the coordinated minimum tax on multinational companies. Rules that allow participating countries to tax non-participating countries undertax multinationals to ultra-high net worth individuals. The report makes proposals along this line, noting that the issue would require an inclusive international discussion. If a minimum taxation standard on billionaires was successfully enforced, there would also be potential economic costs, such as reduced incentives to work or accumulate wealth for the affected taxpayers. These costs must be assessed in context of the observed pre-tax rate of return to wealth for ultra-high net worth individuals, which has been around 7.5% on average per year net of inflation over the past 4 decades globally. 7.5% return on wealth. That's just fucking sitting on it, just investing it. 7.5% in real terms. The current effective tax rate of billionaires is equivalent to 0.3% of their wealth. Everything else equal, a well-enforced minimum tax of 2% would reduce their net of tax return from 7.2% to 5.5%. Adverse incentive effects are unlikely to be significant at this level of net of tax return. Because the okay, so just playing devil's advocate, that's like, what, a 2 percentage point reduction almost, which is like over 20%. It's almost a third. It's like somewhere between 20 and 30%, closer to 30% reduction. Now, I kind of get where they're coming from in the sense that, like, it's still worth accruing as much wealth as you can at that kind of rate of return. But if you think that the effect of incentives is, increasing in the level of the incentive, then his point doesn't apply. Just like if you believe the incentive story and you increase the return to 10%, then you would get even more wealth, according to this argument. So I don't buy this like, oh, that looks kind of big. I don't know. I don't think that fully engages with the counter argument. Not that I believe that either, but also accruing wealth isn't necessarily a good thing. Because the population affected would be small, in fact, that's the argument I would make. I would make that argument. There's no reason to believe that this wealth accumulation is just good, just because it's wealth accumulation. Because the population affected would be small, the overall impact of a 2% minimum tax on global economic growth is unlikely to be large. Because the standard is structured as a minimum tax, there are no concerns about double taxation. Okay, that latter point, but again, if you believe that
the dual status that illiquid assets like stocks to both be too illiquid to tax yet valid collateral for debt seems like a central problem.
Yeah, I agree. If you can use something as collateral, it should be taxed, or vice versa. It's a good point. Thanks for the super chat. I've heard about taxing in kind, like as in taxing actual stocks, taking a percentage of stocks, holding them, and then maybe as like a social wealth fund or something. So the state has a social wealth fund of like a diversified portfolio gathered at least in part from the wealthy, the very wealthy. Thanks for subscribing, Will. But yeah, sorry, so this point, because the population affected would be small, the overall impact of a 2% minimum tax on global economic growth is unlikely to be large. So I do get where he's coming from, but like he seems to be addressing that, what was that? He seems to be trying to address the like Randian superhero argument, doesn't he? He's like, and if you believe that like Elon Musk is a wealth creator to a huge extent, and he's like this extremely successful entrepreneur that brings together loads of different people and ideas and drives forward the electric vehicle market in the USA to an extent that almost nobody else could, and creates loads and loads of wealth in the process, which some people believe, and not just weird Musk stans. If you believe that, then you're not going to be convinced by this, right? Because you're going to say, well, you're taxing, it's a small group of people, but they create a lot of the wealth. They're Randian superheroes. There's all sorts of people drove Tesla and SpaceX or whatever forward, or drive it forward, I should say. And Elon Musk, let's put it mildly, has negative externalities, but still, I just don't think he's that good at addressing the counter arguments. It is something I see a lot. I don't think people are very aware of the counter arguments to their positions. Beyond the revenue gains for governments, there would be benefits in terms of... Oh, wait. I already said that. Sorry. Wait, have I just reread the entire bit? Oh, shit. I scrolled up. I scrolled up when I was faffing. Or did I? Or did I just get muddled up? Okay, that's really annoying. No, wait. I was on this bit. How did I end up back up here? Good lord, what's going on? Have I got early onset dementia? Okay. Ultimately, it is for each person as a citizen and voter to weigh the potential benefits and costs of this policy. Our gains in tax revenues, resources that could be used to support sustained economic development through investments in education, healthcare, public infrastructure, the energy transition and climate change mitigation, worth the potential costs. Are there better options? To inform this assessment, it is useful to consider alternative approaches to improving tax progressivity. Section 5 discusses and quantifies the impact of these other approaches, increasing the progressivity of existing individual income taxes, improving the taxation of estate and inheritance, and regulating harmful tax practices such as special tax regimes that provide reduced tax rates for wealthy individuals. While these... Okay, so this is quite interesting. He is addressing alternative proposals. That looks like one of the more interesting parts of the report. While these reforms would be valuable, the main conclusion is that they would not be as powerful as the minimum taxation standard proposal in this blueprint. The key virtue of a minimum tax is that it addresses all forms of tax avoidance at once. The key virtue of expressing the tax as a fraction of wealth is that, for ultra-high net worth individuals, wealth is harder to manipulate than income. The key virtue of an annual tax, as opposed to a one-off tax at the time of death, is that it more effectively safeguards progressivity at the top of the wealth distribution, because it ensures that the individuals with the highest ability to pay taxes cannot postpone taxation for years or decades. This report takes a primarily economic perspective. Its goal is to clarify how a coordinated minimum tax on ultra-high net worth individuals would work, to provide a quantitative analysis of different scenarios, to consider design issues that would take seriously the incentives of the different actors affected, and to make explicit the trade-offs involved in the different possible choices, including the choice of the status quo. This blueprint also touches on some legal considerations. Additional legal analysis on specific points would be valuable in future work as a political discussion on these issues progresses. Okay. So here's a lesson in reading papers and reports. Sometimes if you're enjoying the paper a lot, it might be worth just reading it like a book, but generally speaking, that is not the best way to read academic, formal, detailed articles, in-depth reports, and that kind of thing. You want to read the intro and the summary to get a good summary, funnily enough. But you pick out the bits that look the most interesting and get an idea of what the different sections are about. One thing I like to do, and this is quite common, is to, after reading the introduction, I like to scroll through and look at the figures, the tables, the statistics, some of the maths, just to get an idea of like what kind of data or concepts, if it's theory, that we're looking at. When I highlighted the text, it jumped me back up the page. Yeah, I got a bit confused there. Warren Buffett noted that nobody invests less due to taxes. Taxes are a percentage of profit, not a fixed cost. If you have more money after investing than before, you'll invest if you can. True. I do think that's true, at least up to a point. But like, say you tax 99%. Surely people would just be like that. Average tax rates by income group and for billionaires, right? So this is, I've seen this before. This is really weird, right? So this chart is not consistent with common narratives about Europe and the USA. So you've got high tax rate on the poorest in France, the Netherlands, and Italy. It's sort of steady in all countries up until the rich. So the middle class and the poor are taxed similarly. In France, it's a bit better on the poor, relatively speaking. In the Netherlands, it's a bit harder on the poor, and Italy. But this is, reasonable fluctuations. But then it dips right down for the rich. So bear in mind, this isn't a linear scale at the bottom. You're talking, you got the 95th percentile here. 95th to 99th, sorry. 99th to 99.9, 99.9 to 99.99, etc. So you're getting like, and then billionaires are here. This goes right down in the European countries. But weirdly, the tax rate for billionaires is like not far away from the tax rate for the poor in the US. So it's not a progressive system, obviously. It's not good, I'm just saying. It's more similar in the US for the rich and the poor, more consistent than it is in these European countries. I should imagine the wealth equality situation in Chile is pretty bad. Effective income tax rates by income groups and for billionaires. Okay, wait, so this adds a nuance to this. So this is effective. Percentage of pre-tax income. I remember getting confused about this before. Wait, so average tax rates and effective tax rates. The only difference with figure 1 is that here only the individual income tax is considered, other taxes such as consumption tax. Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Okay, so that's just income taxes, figure 2. This includes all taxes, corporation tax, consumption tax. Individual tax rates paid by billionaires. Norway has a wealth tax. See, it's quite high in the US. Now, I think Zucman said this before. I think that this is because the USA taxes you based on your country of origin. So it's actually harder to avoid tax in the USA. It's quite... Here we are. Wealth of the top 0.0001%. So this is like, I think this is like 2,000 people. This is basically billionaires. The top one household out of 1 million includes about 3,000 households. This says 3,000. It's not, yeah, it's 0.0001% is like billionaires. Therefore, the average income per adult, average wealth per adult. Oh, sorry. Okay. I was a bit confused because I was like, why are there... Okay, sorry. Yeah, those are just percentages for compare. That's kind of a weird way to... It's just not usual to do a graph like that, but whatever. So income per adult grew around here. Wealth per adult grew around here on average across this period. And the wealth per of the billionaires grew like by, about this much on average. So, obviously, their wealth is growing much faster than other people's wealth, let alone their income. Revenue projections. So 1% rate, 2% rate, 3% rate. Um, 1% rate, that would make 0. Is that supposed to be less than 100 million? A 1% rate would raise this much. Why is that 0? I think that's what I don't understand. A 1% rate. With a 1% minimum rate, centimillionaires other than billionaires would pay no additional tax since their current tax rate is above 1%. Ah, okay. Yep, okay. So that's because it's already absorbed by the taxes they pay. Because remember, this tax is like, they're preventing double taxation, so they're making sure the wealth tax doesn't clash with an income tax. If you're a US citizen living abroad, you do still pay federal taxes. Yeah, sorry. Citizen, not place of birth, because you can change citizenship.
Not sure about your take, but as an American living abroad, I don't recommend citizenship-based taxation. It feels punitive relative to other nations.
But do you pay... Aren't American tax rates generally lower than other countries' tax rates? So do you pay those instead of the tax rates of the country where you're residing? It's not on top of, is it? Thanks for the super chat. So this is the average income tax rates by income group with the 2% minimum tax on billionaires. So you can see that goes down and then up. And then with centimillionaires, that would also go up. So that's like flatter. So it's funny because, again, it's not even progressive. Even with this wealth tax, the system isn't progressive, right? Bear that in mind. If people are like, oh, I can't believe you're taking all of the... right. I mean, it's okay. It's like slightly progressive if you want to be... Yeah, mate, it's like... But really, you're talking about everybody's tax is somewhere between like 37%. Average tax rate is somewhere between like 37% and like 41%. And billionaires aren't even taxed the most. If it were 3%, you'd be looking at a progressive tax system. I mean, it's tricky, isn't it, with all these bits? So much avoidance. Share of global billionaires living in a country different from their country of citizenship. It's still not that high. That's really interesting. Look at that. So it's gone up a bit. 2010. I wonder... Interesting. Panama Papers? No, Panama Papers were later than that. But like, it's still under 10%. It's on top of. Okay, that does seem a little bit tight. If you're paying US taxes and other taxes. Oh, you can accept the money. Okay, that makes more sense. Oh, right, yeah, okay. The legal stuff. I mean, paying taxes in the USA is such a nightmare. And it's like deliberately so to make people... Well, firstly, because the companies that people end up hiring to help them with the taxes, they benefit from it and they lobby against tax simplification. And secondly, because Republicans and anti-tax ideologues lobby against tax simplification because that process of paying taxes being so difficult makes people hate the government more. There was an interesting podcast on NPR called something like Tax Hero about this. Why does the income tax fail at the top end? In principle, the individual income tax should be progressive. One of its goals is to offset the regressivity of indirect taxes such as the VAT, which absorb a higher fraction of income at the bottom of the income distribution than the top. In practice, the income tax fails to offset this regressivity at the very top. To understand the issue, one needs first to note that the ultra-high net worth individuals derive their income not from the wages they earn, but from the wealth they own. More precisely, in most cases from the businesses they own. These businesses make profits, which are typically subject to the corporate income tax. The core limitation of the individual income tax is that wealthy individuals can structure their wealth to report little to no taxable individual income and thus avoid the individual income tax. This tax avoidance is done in two main ways: by avoiding dividend distribution and capital gains realizations, by using holding companies and similar legal structures. People with controlling stakes in corporations can instruct these companies to avoid distributing dividends. When no dividend is paid out, profit is reinvested in the corporation. This reinvestment contributes to increasing the value of the company, boosting its share price. When shareholders sell their shares, they realize capital gains, which in many countries are subject to individual income taxation. However, by holding on to one's shares, this tax on capital gains can also be avoided. Thus, by avoiding dividend distributions and capital gains realizations, people with controlling stakes in corporations, such as majority owners of private corporations, or people with significant voting rights in publicly listed firms, can avoid reporting any taxable income. 2 remarks are in order. First, even when wealthy individuals report no taxable income, they do earn economic income, their share of the profits made by the companies they own. Even if this economic income is not distributed as dividends, it is neither virtual nor trapped in any meaningful sense. Income can either be saved or consumed. When a firm's profit is not distributed, this income is saved and reinvested in that firm according to the wealth of its owners. Ultra-high net worth individuals can also consume that income, e.g. by borrowing money, for instance by pledging shares in their firms as collateral and using the tax-free proceeds of such loans to buy goods and services. The proceeds of these loans can be used to invest in other assets, such as shares in other companies. In sum, even when billionaires avoid reporting any taxable income, they can use their economic income to save, diversify their wealth, or consume. It is very revealing. I think it epitomizes the current ultra wealthy and monopolies that I'd say like the best approach for somebody who has a large growing company that is making a lot of money. Generally speaking, the best approach is just to keep investing in that company and live, take a relatively low income out of it so that you don't get taxed too much, and then enjoy the various benefits that just come from having a large company. And like we said earlier, that allows you to use this wealth as collateral. And I think the wealth also buys you other things, like less obvious, less tangible things like influence and power. Second, ultra-high net worth individuals are not the only ones to benefit from this form of tax avoidance. In principle, less wealthy individuals can also invest in non-dividend paying companies and avoid realizing capital gains. In many countries, there are also other forms of tax-exempt income, for instance, investment income earned in retirement accounts. What makes the situation of ultra-high net worth individuals distinctive is that these individuals can shield virtually all their income from income tax because, for them, virtually all income derives from their ownership of businesses. As one moves down the income distribution, a growing fraction of income derives from wages, pension income, and other income sources, which cannot avoid the individual income tax. Now, I suppose the counter-argument to this would be that by investing money into their companies, they're actually creating more wealth, and that's both good and kind of an intended consequence of the tax system. Again, I do think wealth brings its own problems. One thing that just when I look into billionaires and the ultra wealthy these days, all of the dynamics, about how they use their wealth, they're very different to just like people that get paid loads. Those people exist, and there is obviously overlap, but like people who earn a lot of money enjoy very nice lives and they should be taxed more. But these people are like, they own economic empires. They're extremely powerful and influential. That alone is enough reason to tax them. The second method used by ultra-high net worth individuals to avoid income tax involves the use of personal wealth holding companies and similar legal structures. These holdings serve as nominal owners of shares in a corporation. Dividends paid by that corporation are formally received by another company, the holding, and as such, free of the individual income tax. Dividends received by holdings are also free of the corporate tax in most countries. For the same reasons as those mentioned above, these dividends, even if formally paid to a holding, are neither virtual nor trapped in any meaningful sense. They constitute economic income that can be made by the persons who control the holdings to save, diversify their wealth, or consume. The main... Wait, did he just say that? Neither virtual nor trapped. Stop copying and pasting, Gabrielle. They constitute economic income that can be used by the persons who control the holdings to save. Yeah, the main difference is when dividends are paid to a holding, the individual income tax is avoided. It is. To what extent are the very wealthy? Is their day-to-day activity and consumption just based on credit, a level and like interest rate that none of us could get access to, and they can just use their wealth as collateral for that, as long as their company is growing, they don't really have to worry about it? A more centralized approach to income distribution. I don't know what you're talking about, like, because taxes are a centralized approach to income distribution as far as I'm concerned. But do you mean like a sort of Gosplan type thing? Some countries have anti-abuse provisions that limit and in some cases prevent the use of holdings for income tax avoidance purposes. This has most notably been the case in the United States since two laws passed in the first half of the 20th century, as described, e.g. in Sayers and Zucman. The first of these provisions, the accumulated earnings tax, in force since 1921, is levied on the undistributed corporate profits deemed to be retained for tax avoidance purposes. The second, the personal holding company tax since 1937, is a 20% surtax that applies to the undistributed income of a personal holding company. These provisions prevent wealthy individuals from avoiding the income tax by retaining income in holdings. Consequently, the use of personal wealth holding companies is limited in the United States. So that's really interesting. Because when you think of the US as like the heart of capitalist inequality, you miss that it does do some things better than Europe in this respect. In European countries where anti-abuse rules are weaker, studies suggest that the use of holding companies is widespread among ultra-high net worth individuals. These holdings allow owners of large stakes in dividend-paying companies to avoid dividend taxation. As a result, in these countries, effective income tax rates converge to nearly zero at the top of the wealth distribution. That is crazy. Zero. This is illustrated by Figure 2, which shows how individual income tax rates vary across the income distribution for United States, France, and Netherlands. As in Figure 1, effective tax rates for each group of the population are computed by dividing taxes paid by a pre-tax income using the same definition of taxes and pre-tax income in each country. The only difference with Figure 1 is that only the individual income tax is considered. Other taxes such as consumption and corporate tax are excluded. So look at that dip. Whereas, yeah, the US still kind of, I don't know if you want to say it's regressive, but if you look at like this bit, it kind of is. So it's like the sort of middle wealthy I mean, the 90th percentile, simply the rich do actually pay the most tax, but the very rich don't. Income tax, anyway. If the VATs are flat, isn't the income going to progressive redistribution, is that just as good? Yes. But I can't imagine a scenario in which you would want a regressive tax system at the point of implementation. But yeah, you do have to consider the whole thing. And if you're talking about redistribution in terms of money, then that kind of compensates. Say you got a UBI, a regressive tax system with, or a flat tax system with a UBI. But if you're talking about benefits in kind, like public services, then that might not make up for the loss of disposable income. People still need cash. I don't know. Good question. As shown by figure 2, the individual income tax is progressive for most of the population before becoming sharply regressive at the top end of the distribution. Hey, that's what I just said. Best Graph Interpreter Award. Effective income tax rates rise from about 0 to 5% at the bottom of the income distribution to a higher 15 to 20, depending on the countries, and then start to fall. The regressivity starts at a high around the 95th percentile of the pre-tax income distribution in the Netherlands, the 99th. All right, okay, this is just numbers. These are just numbers. Details. Okay, let's read this bit of maths here. We're going in for a bit of maths. Get ready. Audio is delayed. Of course it is. My stream always does that. It should be fine now. Why does it matter if billionaires have relatively low tax rates? First, there is a loss of tax revenue for governments. As we shall see in section 2.5 below, a minimum tax ensuring that the effective rate of dollar billionaires, all taxes included, does not fall below that of other social groups would generate about $200 to $250 billion globally. This is the mechanical loss of tax revenue caused by the undertaxation of billionaires today, relative to a benchmark of non-regressivity. Tax avoidance at the top of the wealth distribution also has a dynamic effect on wealth concentration. To see this, denote by WT the wealth of an individual at the end of year T. This dynamic equation of wealth accumulation between T and T plus 1 can be written as WT plus 1 equals 1 plus R minus T, or tau, times by WT plus B tilde. R is the stochastic rate of return to wealth. Tau denotes individual capital income and wealth tax paid, as a fraction of wealth. And B, any stochastic labour income net of consumption and other taxing transfers. It is well known that under a number of regularity conditions, such a stochastic process converges to a stationary distribution. The stationary distribution has a Pareto upper tail, and the Pareto coefficient, which governs the concentration of wealth, depends on the average net of tax rate return of R tilde minus tau. A lower average individual capital tax rate of tau, for instance, due to low taxation of ultra high net worth individuals, increases net of tax return, leading to a higher stationary concentration of wealth. So they're kind of saying something obvious and not obvious at the same time. If you tax wealth, wealth inequality will be reduced. But I think what's interesting about this is that the dynamic effect of a relatively low tax rate can be quite large. and the reduction in inequality can be large relative to the tax rate itself. If the net of tax return to wealth rises with wealth, then the wealth accumulation process is explosive. The distribution of wealth admits no stationary equilibrium, right? So this will happen if wealthier individuals on average have higher pre-tax returns, e.g. due to globalization, and the tax system fails to offset this returns differential through a progressive enough tax system, right? You see, so it's like the wealth of the wealthy increases with no bound if you don't have this kind of system. It will also happen if individuals have the same pre-tax rate of return, but the capital tax system is regressive with wealth. Then, as long as the net of tax rate of return R minus tau is positive for the wealthiest individuals, the distribution of wealth is non-stationary. Wealth concentration will keep rising over time. But that's so even if it's positive at all, the net return. Well, let's see where they're going with this. I don't think that so Akovian, I don't think that a wealth tax is enough to fund UBI. On one of the other streams, I did some back of the envelope calculations. I think a global wealth tax would be enough to end poverty if it were targeted at the bottom sort of, I don't know, 100 million, let's say. No, I calculated it as like the percentage of the population that are in extreme poverty, defined as being below $2.15 a day. If you targeted it at that, you could like bring up their incomes. You could more than double their incomes. There's nothing inherently evil or wrong about billionaires, and the billion is just an arbitrary size. I feel that should be established as a point of unity in a tax debate. Well, yeah, but there's nothing inherently evil about somebody who earns over, £60,000 or whatever the highest tax bracket is in the UK. It's just like you have to make these decisions. I just think a billionaire is a focal point for someone who's very, very rich. But he does actually talk about centimillionaires in this quite a lot, and I feel like a centimillionaire tax is a good thing as well. The analysis highlights that the individual capital tax rate tau plays a critical role for the dynamic of wealth inequality. For billionaires, whose income almost entirely derives from capital, this tax rate is equal to the amount of individual income tax plus individual capital tax expressed as a fraction of wealth. For other individuals, whose income derives at least in part from labour, this tax rate includes only the fraction of individual income taxes that correspond to taxes on capital income, plus individual capital taxes. In both cases, these tax rates exclude business-level capital taxes, most importantly the corporate income tax. Figure 3 reports the individual capital tax rate for billionaires in the 4 countries studied so far, as well as in Norway and Sweden, based on ongoing work by Ring et al. For example, the figure also reports the flat line at 2%, indicating the minimum amount of tax the billionaires would have to pay under the baseline proposal formulated in this report. Yeah. Norway's wealth tax. I'd like to know more about Norway's wealth tax. There isn't enough wealth. Ecovian, there are other ways of taxing. I'm just talking about a wealth tax specifically. Not, you can increase income taxes, capital gains tax. You can increase, taxes on the Western middle class. One thing I remember always remember about giving everybody a decent standard of living. Like, there is enough food to feed the global population like 1.3 times over or something like that. Last time I checked. I think there are probably enough like flat screens for everybody to have one. There's a lot of stuff. I think we can definitely provide a good standard of living for the population at the current, level of output. But a wealth tax is just one thing. But I keep saying this, right? I keep saying this. A wealth tax is not a massive revenue raiser. It's not a massive revenue raiser. Like it just because taxing a stock generally is quite difficult to get like money out of a stock, out of these estimated values, that stock market values that make up so much of wealth. Like, imagine taxing wealth by 50%. You'd just be talking about seizing entire companies, and we can do that. I know some people want to do that, but I don't think that's a wealth tax. That's like a complete change in ownership structure, nationalization, or whatever other ownership form you're talking about. So you're not going to raise that much revenue with a wealth tax. It has other aims: reducing inequality, and the power of the very wealthy. It's good for like political and social cohesion and fairness. People seeing that these gross inequalities are being dealt with. The wealthy knowing that they too do live in a society. Billionaires have extremely low capital tax rates. They pay the equivalent of only 0 to 0.6% of their wealth in individual taxes. The individual capital tax rate is close to 0% for ultra-high net worth individuals in countries such as the Netherlands, where, as we have seen, the individual tax fails to tax billionaires. It is a bit higher in the United States due to the stronger anti-avoidance rules preventing the use of holding companies. In all cases, the effective capital tax rate of billionaires is very low relative to their pre-tax rate return of wealth, which is of the order R equals 7.5%. This is an important paragraph. The capital tax rate for billionaires is low even in countries with wealth taxes, France and Norway. Oh, there is a wealth tax in France. I didn't spot that. There's a tiny little blue sliver at the top there in France. You can't see it. See? See, look at that little guy. Look at that little wealth tax. Just a little wealth tax. Just a tiny little wealth tax. Past and existing wealth taxes have so far failed to significantly tax ultra-high net worth individuals due to a combination of exemptions, most importantly for owner-managers of large companies, design issues, mechanisms capping the amount of wealth tax owed to a fraction of taxable income, preferential valuation for closely held businesses, and poor enforcement. Due to these issues, billionaires paid no significant amount of wealth tax in France in 2016, the year covered by their study, and then it was abolished in 2018. In Norway, even though design issues are less severe than in France, the effective wealth tax rate of billionaires does not exceed 0.3%, significantly below the top statutory tax rate of 0.85%. I don't think you can objectively define fairness at all. I think it's something that's arrived at through various negotiations at the social and individual level. Have I read John Rawls? Not directly. So if you Mufti Tufti, if you don't think that inequality matters at all, as distinct from poverty, then you probably wouldn't be in favor of a wealth tax, which is the position of some people, like kind of centrist types or like neoliberal types. But if you think that inequality is a problem in itself, then you want to reduce the wealth and income of the wealthy. So, yeah, it just depends on that, doesn't it? But like, if you think about the runaway wealth of billionaires today, in terms like how much has Elon Musk's wealth grown in the past year? It's like doubled, and it was already 200 billion or something, and now it's like almost half a trillion. Maybe it's half a trillion already. If that buys him disproportionate power and influence over the economy, his market, and also over like other industries, like his ability to buy up social media, Twitter. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post and is running it into the ground. And over politics, obviously, like and influencing government and over other wealthy people, then you would want to reduce that inequality. And a wealth tax is one way of doing that quite effectively. The consequence of the failure of the individual income tax and wealth taxes when they exist is that billionaires have a lower effective capital tax rates than the average person. On average, people in the countries considered in Figure 3 pay the equivalent of around 1.1% of their wealth in individual capital taxes. The rate for billionaires is only about a quarter of that. One notable contributor to this imbalance is residential property taxes, which are significant in many countries, typically of the order of 1% of housing wealth. Residential property taxes are tax on wealth, but on a specific form of wealth, real estate. This form of wealth accounts for the bulk of wealth for the middle class, but for a vanishingly small fraction of wealth for ultra-high net worth individuals. In effect, the middle class is subject to wealth taxation, while billionaires are largely free from wealth taxation. That's such an interesting point. Of course it is. Yeah, property taxes tax the middle class. And as a proportion of their wealth, they don't tax billionaires very much. I didn't think about that. I don't think tax schemes will work until the entire world is pretty much on one tax code. Otherwise, it's a race to the bottom to attract businesses. I think that's basically Zucman's point. I think he's all about these international agreements. He opened by talking about them. Would seizing their resources stop them? I mean, to an extent, but there is a very interesting paper about the Chinese Revolution, both 1911 and the later Cultural Revolution. Well, not 1911. I think it was 1949, right, where it actually came to fruition. The 1949 victory of the Communist Party and the 1966 Cultural Revolution, both of which completely obliterated the elites, like sometimes literally, by taking all of their land, killing some of them, and then 20 years later they did it again because Mao got some ideas in his head. And putting aside the moral atrocities, they found in this paper that even down the road, like the grandchildren of a landlord who was dispossessed during the revolution was richer than that of a non-landlord. But again, these people have been completely dispossessed, dragged out of their homes, often beaten, mocked, humiliated, imprisoned. They ended up wealthier than the average person. And they attribute that to social networks, effectively. Basically, very rich people have quite strong social networks and support. And I think even if you take their money away, they do have a lot of advantages. So, it's a difficult question. It is a difficult, you can't, I think that was quite an eye-opening paper for me. I think it's why I don't always find it very thoughtful when some people are like, oh, we just need a revolution. It's like, man, they did it in China twice and it didn't eliminate the inequality. It's why I'm quite willing to entertain these kind of technocratic reforms that I think are deemed kind of wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed, centrist liberalism by some internet leftists, because I think that ultimately inequalities can be really, really hard to change over the long term, no matter what you do, even if you execute them. But yeah, anyway. A simple computation illustrates the role played by the relatively low tax rates of billionaires in the fast rise of their wealth since the 1980s. According to data compiled by Forbes, the wealth of global billionaires has grown on average by 7.1% net of inflation between 1987 and 2024. With a capital tax rate of 0.3% and consumption equivalent to 0.1% of their wealth, this growth rate implies a gross return to wealth of 7.5% per year. This is higher than the comparable average global pre-tax return to wealth, which can be estimated to be in the range of around 6 to 7% over this period. Right. Instead of being offset by the tax system, the difference in pre-tax returns has been magnified by it. In this accounting, about half the net excess return of billionaires owes to their relatively low individual capital tax rates. They add to their wealth at a faster pace than the rest of the population, leading to an explosive wealth accumulation process. Figure 4 illustrates this dynamic by plotting the evolution of the wealth of global billionaires, adjusted for the size of global population, scaled by world GDP from 87 to 2024. Oh, this is as a percentage of world GDP. I missed that before. There are about 2,800 billionaires, households. This corresponds to roughly 0.001%, about 1 out of 1 million households. It's interesting that billionaires are 1 in a million. I'm trying to figure out whether that's like a good soundbite to tell people or if it's just confusing. 1 in a million people is 1 in a million households is a billionaire household. Globally. The correction is necessary to avoid showing the wealth of these quasi-billionaire households is estimated using standard Pareto interpolation techniques. Right, is that just adjusting for population? I don't know. That's a technicality. Let's not dwell on it too much. Abolish private property. But you can't get away with that. Mao did that. Surely he did that. If Maoism can't stop intergenerational inequality, nothing can. Except perhaps a return to pre-civilization. 1 in a million people is a billionaire. There's a way of expressing that. I'm going to think about it. Like on the radio or something, a little sound bite. You have to abolish money too. I just think these easier said than done. People do use money, and especially people who have grown up in a society that has money. You're talking about extremely strict bans on a lot of things that people use, enforced well. I honestly think abolish X. Maybe I could make a video about this one day. Abolish X. I don't like, and I don't mean the social media site. I mean abolish a thing. I don't like it as a call. I don't think it works. Like, I want to abolish billionaires. Don't get me wrong. I would like to see that. But I just am much more in favour of talking about the actual things that will get us there, of which there are many. It's like the goal of communism. It's like the Marxist goal of communism. It's a direction. Abolish X is a direction. But it's not... So if you win a revolution, I think people fantasize about this. I think they're like, if I were in charge and I were the head of the revolution, I would simply abolish X. And it's like, no, that's not how anything works ever. Even after a revolution, you have to utilize existing political and power structures and compromise with other factions and deal with, the material conditions, as one might put it. If you spend 1,000 a day, it takes you 2,700 years to spend 1 billion. Yeah. Or if you count to 1 million, you do it in like 30 days. But if you count to 1 million, you do it in like a week. If you count to 1 billion, it takes like 36 years. A good replacement for markets? No, I'm a reluctant market advocate for that reason. I don't think that there is anything else that can replace them in a modern complex economy. Unless you say you don't want a modern complex economy. Look how much success Zoran is having by calling for an increase in social workers to help the police. That is the same core policy as defund the police, but without the bad slogan. Yeah. And that is the message of The End of Policing, that book by Alex Vitali. Anyway, all good points in the chat. All good points. So, yeah. So it's basically their point. Their point in here is like the net of tax returns on wealth for the very wealthy are higher than net of tax returns on wealth for the rest of the population. Hence, the wealth of the very rich has been growing exponentially. Okay. So, I'd like to read the implementation challenges more than just like the simulations, because they do a bunch of simulations that are kind of like, what if we had a 2% tax on billionaires and centimillionaires? So the implementation challenges. I think this is an important section. The standard proposed in this blueprint uses wealth as a reference to compute the minimum amount of tax owed by ultra-high net worth individuals. Using wealth is desirable because narrow notions of income do not capture the actual economic income of ultra-high net worth individuals and their ability to pay taxes. The different possible implementations of the standard, a presumptive income tax, a tax on a broad notion of income including unrealized capital gains, or a wealth tax, each require measuring wealth, both because the standard is expressed as a fraction of wealth and because these various instruments all require measuring wealth or wealth changes. Building on existing methods, it should be possible to obtain reliable estimates of the wealth of ultra-high net worth individuals. You know, I do have to admit, this is not designed to be read out loud to anyone. So I do appreciate you all bearing with me, because just the way it's so report-like. Be thankful I'm not reading every single word. That's all I'll say. Most countries already have methods in place to value top-end wealth because they have inheritance or estate taxes. These methods constitute a natural starting point for national implementations of the proposed standard. They could be strengthened and harmonized just as the International Agreement on the Minimum Tax for Multinationals created a common, harmonized definition of profits. Okay. Build on existing wealth taxes, like property taxes. Good. In practice, the main challenge in estimating the wealth of ultra-high net worth individuals involves the valuation of private businesses, like businesses that are not listed on a stock exchange. According to existing data, about half the wealth of global billionaires is in shares of publicly listed companies, which are straightforward to value. The other half consists mostly of shares in private companies. The private businesses owned by billionaires are typically large, making it possible to ascertain their value by comparing these businesses to similar publicly listed companies. To value private businesses, tax authorities could apply the valuation multiples observed for similar listed businesses in the same industry, multiple of market value to profits, market value to assets, and market value to sales. Tax authorities could also rely on transactions in private business shares with which de facto value private companies and could be made reportable to tax authorities. So half of the company wealth is private. Other forms of wealth, such as art, account for a small fraction of the wealth of billionaires. Valuation methods also exist for these other forms of wealth. For instance, valuable artwork is typically insured. Insurance values could be made reportable to tax authorities. One potential concern with a tax on billionaires using wealth as a reference is that it might create incentives for the targeted taxpayers to shift their wealth into harder to value asset classes. For instance, firm owners might be less willing to list their companies on the stock market. A potential solution to that concern would be to value listed companies like private firms, i.e. by using multiple of market values to profits, market values to assets, and market values of sales of similar listed firms in the same industry. This would harmonize the treatment of listed and non-listed companies, in effect smoothing out firm-specific variation in the stock price of listed companies. Okay, so you use these estimation methods even if it is publicly listed, but what... To be fair, that kind of reminds me of like machine learning. So that's like...
If you can't live off of tax write-offs, it doesn't matter if you can't value the asset because you have to pay yourself a salary which can be taxed.
Thanks for the super chat. If you can't live off tax, it doesn't matter if you can't value the asset because you have to. Right, okay. But can a lot of them live off tax write-offs if they're billionaires? That would be the worry. Listed companies like private firms using multiple this would harmonize the treatment. Yeah. So if this method is bad, then why extend it to publicly listed companies? But I was thinking you can definitely, it's like a machine learning, right? Where you got training data and out of sample data. And on the training data, you like fit the model and then you use it to predict the out of sample data. And if it doesn't do it correctly, then you go back and you retrain it. And I was thinking that definitely applies to this because half of them are publicly listed. So you use this method, train it on... does that work? if you train it on the... Well, no, of course it doesn't work because you don't know everything about the... No, that's a stupid analogy. But you could just train it all on the publicly listed data in general, and then you could, like, once it fit properly, you could extrapolate it. But they are a different type of firm. I don't know anything about these methods. It's just that that's potentially wouldn't work. You need, but you can live off tax write-offs if you live off credit. If you use your wealth as collateral and don't claim income in the traditional way, I think you can live off just wealth, basically. That's what happens in. That's what happens in. What's that one with Bradley Cooper? That film, Limitless. As soon as he gets rich, this like even richer guy is just like, oh, I'm going to give you a line of credit. And he just lives off that and has loads of money. But it's not taxed. Overcoming financial opacity. A successful enforcement of the proposed standard faces two main practical challenges: how to minimize wealth concealment, how to identify beneficial ownership of assets and ensure that information is available to the relevant tax authorities. Addressing the risk of wealth concealment. An obstacle to taxing ultra-high net worth individuals historically has been financial opacity in offshore financial centres. Until 2017, most offshore financial institutions did not communicate information to foreign tax authorities except on an ad hoc basis when information was requested for taxpayers who had aroused suspicion. This bank secrecy made it relatively easy for wealthy individuals to evade taxes on offshore income and wealth. Over the past 15 years, bank secrecy has been curtailed through increased information exchange between countries. The United States started the process by enacting the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act in 2010, which was implemented in 2014. A similar system, the Common Reporting Standard or CRS, was then implemented among more than 100 countries and territories starting in 2017. FATCA, there you go, you know it's a US acronym. You know it's the US when they've got an acronym. Zucman just keeps saying ultra high net worth individuals. Like a classic French romantic. Anything in the US, it's got to be an acronym. FATCA in 2010, which was implemented. Also like a slightly weird acronym, like a little bit funny, a little bit boomer, was implemented in 2014. A similar system, the Common Reporting Standard, was then implemented among more than 100 countries. Blah, 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 blah. Details. Okay. Information is shared. Both FATCA and the CRS have contributed to reducing offshore tax evasion. Summarizing this preliminary evidence, the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024 tentatively estimates that offshore tax evasion has declined by a factor of about 3 in less than 10 years. Before 2013, households owned the equivalent of 10% of world GDP and financial wealth in tax havens globally, the bulk of which was undeclared to tax authorities and belonged to high net worth individuals. Today, there is the equivalent of 10% of world GDP in offshore household financial wealth, but according to the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024, only about 25% of it evades taxation. This evolution shows that international cooperation and the creation of common standards can be powerful tools to support domestic taxation. It's kind of like the revolution that nobody's heard about this. I find it so interesting. Nobody talks about it, but we have reduced tax avoidance and increased and sort of brought tax havens to heel somewhat. So Daphne Carunia Galizia. Her sacrifice was not in vain. Despite this progress, limits in information sharing remain. First, it remains possible to own financial assets that escape being reported on, whether it is due to non-compliance by offshore financial institutions or to limitations in the design of the automatic exchange of bank information. Second, not all assets are covered by this system, most importantly real estate, other non-financial assets such as art, and shares in private companies. Research highlights how some individuals who used to conceal financial assets in offshore banks may have exploited these loopholes by shifting holdings to real estate. Improving the effective taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals requires improving international information exchange. The common reporting standard should be extended to include real estate and other non-financial assets. This would work best if combined with improved reporting on the ownership of shell companies, which are often used as nominal owners for luxury real estate. There is growing support at the G20 level and beyond for including real estate in the automatic exchange of bank information, see OECD 2023. Other assets such as cryptocurrency also need to be incorporated into the CRS. Hell yeah. It is just mad how quickly the financial sector evolves in a way that allows things to escape detection by the authorities and the media and the public. Just like different forms of financial instrument, different corporate forms, different accounting practices, different forms of like currency, right? Like cryptocurrency, if you want to call it a real currency. If you view it as all trying to escape regulation and taxation, all of these developments, like, you won't go that far wrong. Oh, thanks, Slayer, for linking the paper. Another challenge with successfully enforcing a minimum tax on billionaires involves identifying beneficial ownership of assets. There has been progress in this area in recent years thanks to the creation of beneficial ownership registries, but gaps remain. Building on existing policies, two potential improvements can be considered. A first step would involve adding beneficial ownership requirements to the country-by-country reports of multinational companies. Since 2016 to 2017, large multinational companies have been required to compile country-by-country reports detailing their profit, revenue, assets, etc. in the different countries where they operate. These reports are filed confidentially with the tax authority of the multinational's parent company and then exchanged internationally between tax authorities. In addition to the variables currently reported, multinational firms could be required to list their main beneficial owners, such as shareholders who beneficially own more than 1% of their stock, either directly or indirectly through holdings and other intermediate structures. Because the bulk of wealth billionaires derives from their ownership stakes in multinational companies, such a reporting would allow tax authorities to capture a large fraction of the wealth of global billionaires. But what about the private companies? Because they said that they were half of all of it in the previous section. Identifying the main beneficial owners of multinational companies should be possible even when the shares are held through intermediaries, such as family holding companies, investment funds, trusts, etc., because financial intermediaries themselves are required to identify beneficial owners by virtue of existing anti-money laundering regulations. Lowering the revenue threshold for mandatory compilation of country-by-country reports, currently set at 750 million euros, would allow to capture an even greater share of the wealth of ultra-high net worth individuals. Because country-by-country reports are already exchanged internationally, the modest enhancement of existing reporting systems could play a critical role in allowing tax authorities to enforce the common standard, not only on domestic, but also, if needed, on non-resident, blah 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 individuals. Dealing with imperfect coordination. So, some countries, most prominently the United States, tax citizens no matter where they live, no matter how rich they are, and no matter how long they have been residing in that country. This contrasts with the general approach followed by most other countries in which taxation is determined by residency. Taxpayers stop being liable for taxes when they move abroad, no matter how long they have lived in their origin country, and no matter how wealthy they have become in that country. That is really interesting. We were talking about this earlier. How did that emerge? And why? Thank you for subscribing, Emery, and Easy Mode. Bokies, if that's how you pronounce it. So they did make this minimum corporate income tax, but the genius thing about it is that although Trump has exited it, I believe, it's designed so that any tax that isn't collected from the United States can be collected by other countries. That's the law. So, like, if they don't collect that tax, that corporate income tax, corporate tax, it's corporate income tax, corporation tax. Fucking hell, my brain is breaking. Corporation tax. That's what it's called. If they don't collect the taxation, the US government, the rest of the G7, G20, EU, they are allowed to. So it's interesting because the incentive for a government is almost always to collect their own tax, otherwise someone else will. Countries implementing the common standard could consider following middle ground approach. They could keep taxing ultra-high net worth individuals after a change of residency for a number of years. This tax obligation would only apply to wealthy individuals who have been long-term residents. Nationality in this system would be irrelevant. Moreover, any tax paid in the new country could be credited against the amount of tax owed in the origin country, thus preventing any double taxation. This system can be justified by the fact that wealthy individuals who have lived for a long time in a country have become rich in that country owe at least part of their success to the education they received in that country, the infrastructure and public goods that allowed their businesses to thrive, the healthcare system, the legal and judicial system, etc. Yeah, I completely agree with that morally. If you're wealthy, you owe a lot to your the country that you get rich in. But also, yeah, I don't understand why that's not an international system. You're taxed based on your citizenship, but there are measures to prevent double taxation. Hello, Floyd. I don't think we need an illustration. We know how that would... that would work, I think. Well, let's see this. To illustrate how this system would operate, consider an ultra-high net worth individual who has spent 40 years of their adult life in country A, implementing the common standard, and decides to move to country B, not implementing the common standard. Country A would keep taxing that person as if they were still a resident of A, with tax credits to offset any taxes paid in B. This obligation could gradually decline over time. For example, the person would remain liable for a fraction of her normal tax liability in A, the amount they would have paid in A if they were still a resident of A, in the first year after the change of residency, for a fraction 40 out of 42 in the second year, etc. A would also ensure that each year the individual involved does not fall below the common minimum tax standard. Formally, consider an ultra-high net worth individual who moves abroad after having lived T years in country A. Denote by XT the tax owed N years after the move from country A if there had been no tax residency. Then the maximum of T over T plus N XT plus N and the common minimum tax, 2% of wealth owed in T plus N, would be collected by the country. So basically it's just like, yeah, the longer you've lived in a country, the more, before you move, the more tax you owe in that country. but it declines for everybody the longer you live in a new country. Kind of interesting. This mechanism would reduce incentives for wealthy people to move abroad for tax reasons. By construction, it would not affect people who move to relatively high tax countries. An advantage of this system is that it addresses all forms of international tax competition, whether it is a standard tax competition on tax rates or preferential tax regimes. Moreover, the system is also immune to the risk of citizenship renunciation that weakens the US system of taxation based on citizenship, since it is not based on nationality. Yeah. How often do wealthy people change citizenship? Was that one of their graphs, or was that about moving? Living in a country different from their country of citizenship. That's not renouncing citizenship. I'd be interested to know the stats on that. This report, Gabrielle Zucman on a wealth tax, it is not exciting, I can tell you that much. But we're all hanging in. 167 people. We're hanging in. We're doing well. Now you know stuff about stuff. Consider that. Consider how valuable that is. As one variation over that system, origin countries could enforce the common minimum tax standard only, as opposed to the full origin country income and wealth tax. Someone who has spent 40 years in country A would each year remain liable for the common minimum tax after relocating to a non-participating country. In that system, participating countries would in effect play the role of tax collector of last resort. They would simply collect the minimum tax that non-participating countries would decline to collect. That's literally what I just said, right, about the USA. So if you're not participating, other countries can get that tax. To enforce the system, the starting point would be the existing international automatic exchange of bank information, the Common Reporting Standard. This Common Reporting Standard would need to be extended to include information on the wealth and income of former residents liable for taxes in their origin country. In contrast to the US system of citizenship-based taxation, the proposed mechanism would affect only a tiny fraction of taxpayers, ultra-high net worth individuals who have been long-term residents in a country and moved to a non-participating country, and for that reason would have limited implementation costs. I mean, I am impressed by this report, despite it being very boring. Despite it being very boring, because they're so practical and detailed about the implementation, like how the policies would look, what kind of systems already exist and can be built on, which it turns out is more than you would have thought for like common information sharing and reporting and documenting and existing taxes. The US has an exit tax if you change citizenship to avoid taxes. It happens, but not too often. One of the minority founders of Facebook did it, and it was big news. Yeah, the exit. Oh, yeah. You just anticipated this, Sam. The system would complement and extend current exit taxes. The goal of current exit taxes is to ensure that wealthy people pay taxes on their past income when changing their residency. The system described here would ensure that, in addition, they would pay a minimum amount of tax on income newly earned after changing their residency if their new country declines to tax them. I don't know if I would have exit taxes and this legacy taxation system. I feel like get rid of the exit taxes, just this legacy taxation system, the same everywhere. That sounds good. Providing incentives to join the agreement. Thanks for joining us, Kenneth. A key feature of the Pillar 2 minimum tax on multinational companies is that it contains incentives for countries to join the agreement. Specifically, according to the undertax payment rules, countries implementing the agreement are allowed to tax the undertaxed profits of multinationals of non-participating countries. This backstop provides incentives for all countries to join, since not joining means relinquishing tax revenues to other countries. To encourage the largest number of countries to join the common standard proposed in this blueprint, this approach could be applied to the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals. it could be translated to billionaires. Oh, sorry. At the outset, it is worth stressing that the way the UTPR could be translated to billionaires would require a thorough and inclusive international discussion. The goal of the paragraphs that follow is not to provide a detailed analysis of these different options, but rather to illustrate the realm of possibilities building on current frameworks and practices. Each scenario would deserve a comprehensive legal analysis that falls outside the scope of this report. First, participating countries could tax the undertaxed billionaires of non-participating countries based on the assets owned by these individuals in participating countries. The assets considered would include real estate, shares in companies, bank accounts, and all the other financial and non-financial assets used for the computation of the common minimum tax standard. In addition to assets, time spent in participating countries could also be considered. In double tax treaties, there are already...
I'm a bit late to the stream. What is the difference between legacy and wealth taxes?
That's not... So, thank you for the super chat. That's not what I said, but I'm happy to clarify. Or maybe it is what I said accidentally. I was talking about leaving taxes, or what was the actual... Exit taxes, sorry. Exit taxes. If somebody renounces their citizenship of a country, they pay an exit tax to try and disincentivize people from changing citizenship based on taxation, and also to provide some revenue when they do that. The legacy proposal that I've just learned about reading this report by Zucman, the G20 report, that would continue to tax people based on their past citizenship, even in the new country. I don't see a need for both of those, because you haven't really renounced your citizenship in a taxation sense in the legacy framework. You're instead sort of gradually renouncing your citizenship as the taxes would get lower and lower based on how long you've lived out of that country. But an exit tax as well seems like double taxation to me. First, participating countries could tax the undertaxed... blah, blah, blah. Rules could be in starting point. Most countries already tax some of the wealth of non-resident individuals through their property taxes, since property taxes are levied on both resident and non-resident individuals alike. This practice could be extended to other forms of wealth beyond tangible properties. For a given country A, it is logical to ask foreign ultra-high net worth individuals to pay some tax in A to the extent that they own some property in A, and their effective tax rate falls below the minimum that applies to domestic ultra-high net worth individuals. You understand? Good. Since the ultra-high net worth individuals affected would own assets in the countries implementing the common minimum tax standard, this tax would be enforceable. But what if they don't own very many assets in the participating countries? How would that be enforced if you didn't know much? Because the non-participating countries were major countries like the USA. The larger the number of countries participating in the standard, the higher would be the fraction of their wealth or time spent in these countries. Second, ultra-high net worth individuals of non-participating countries could be taxed based not only on the assets they personally own in participating countries, but also based on the assets they indirectly own through corporations. As we have seen, most of the wealth of global billionaires derives from their ownership stakes in multinational firms. Consider an ultra-high net worth individual who owns a large stake in a multinational, which in turn owns assets in participating countries. Each of these countries could collect a share of the minimum tax owed by the individual if that tax is not collected by the billionaire's residence country based on the share of the company's global assets located on their territory. To enforce these rules, participating countries would rely on the country-by-country reports of multinational firms enhanced with information on beneficial owners described above. If the individual taxpayer affected refused to pay the tax they owed, an extra corporate tax could be levied on the company. Okay. So you just can't tax their corporations if you can't tax them. Third, and generalizing this approach, participating countries could rely on the nexus criteria and formulas used in Pillar 2. If the firm has a nexus as per Pillar 2 rules in a country, then so too would the billionaire owners of this firm. I don't know what Pillar 2 is, but the allocation of taxing rights on undertaxed billionaires among jurisdictions with nexus could then follow the UTPR formula of Pillar 2. Concretely in this scenario, instead of using only assets as in the second scenario, the country-by-country assets, employment and possibly other metrics such as revenue of billionaire-owned multinationals would be used by participating countries to determine what fraction of the unpaid minimum tax they would collect. The presence of local establishments of these multinationals could be leveraged by participating countries for enforcement purposes, e.g. by creating a liability for these establishments if the tax cannot be collected from the ultra-high net worth individual. To be sure, the translation of the undertax payment rules to the minimum taxation of billionaires raise complex issues that deserve detailed legal analysis. This translation may require renegotiating double tax treaties. It would necessitate international coordination, extensive inclusive discussions. So, a few things. Again, I love all these really complicated, or not complicated, detailed and kind of complex proposals, right? I'm quite happy with them, and they seem to demonstrate quite practical steps to implementing a wealth tax. I do think that this is quite useful for people who just say, well, if you tax the wealthy, they'll just leave. There are a number of systems in place internationally to try and prevent that. We have started to move towards international taxation. We do have things like taxation based on citizenship. We do have things like exit taxes if you change your citizenship. And we can start to think about things like the legacy taxation mechanism where you get taxed based on your previous citizenship as well as your current citizenship. I'm not too worried that we can effectively combat that movement. Two things, though. One is that this system would take a long time to implement. And I feel like with the way things are now, we don't necessarily have that much time. I think that resourcing existing institutions would, well, one, it would help us to develop this, for sure. But I always go back to this paper that found that, the Biden administration, when they just audited the wealthy and increased the money put into into the IRS, and resourced the wealthy to do that, they got $6 back for every $1. Like, they paid to audit the very rich and they got loads of money back from it. Like, such a big return. $6 for every $1. It'd be worth it if you got $1.1 for every $1, but $6. That is what I would like to see in the short term to increase tax revenue and reduce inequality and do something now. Then you're working on a wealth tax in the background, but that's a 5-year 10-year project, especially internationally. You can see that from how complicated this is. The other thing that I think is important is that a substantial wealth tax, I think, would lead to a decline in asset values, even in a relative sense. And that, I'm not saying that's completely bad, but it would have consequences. And politically, you need to make sure that you're ahead of it. You need to be like, that's what this is going to lead to. You need to be like, this is desirable. Let's say it leads to a reduction in house prices. This is desirable. But then what about people in negative equity? You could say this is going to lead to a reduction in stock prices, which might be desirable. But then, what about pension funds, for instance? It seems to me that if you are talking about a decline in asset values when you're talking about taxing the wealthy at this level. What's a cat tax? Is this about furries? Okay. Let me see. So other options. So let's finish this thing. I'm just going to go straight through. Ultimately, it is for each person as a citizen and voter to weigh the potential benefits and costs of the common standard proposed in this blueprint. Are the gains in tax revenues worth the potential costs? Are there better options? To inform this assessment, it's useful to consider alternative approaches to improving progressivity, tackling the forms of tax avoidance that allow ultra-high net worth individuals to have low tax rates, regulating harmful tax practices such as special tax regimes that provide reduced tax rates for wealthy individuals, increasing the progressivity of existing individual income taxes, improving the taxation of estates and inheritance. Methodological details for each scenario are detailed in Appendix B. As we have seen in Section 1, a method used to avoid individual income tax is the use of holding companies. Some countries, notably the United States, have successfully implemented anti-abuse provisions to prevent this tax avoidance. These anti-abuse rules could be implemented by other countries. The main idea would be to penalize the use of personal wealth holding companies by imposing an additional tax or by treating them as transparent for tax purposes. While this would be a highly valuable step, such a reform would not be sufficient to make the taxation truly effective because it would remain possible to retain earnings in downstream businesses. Okay. As we have seen, even in the US, which has strong anti-abuse rules, billionaires have low effective tax rates. More broadly, there is a variety of legal structures and techniques used, making it difficult to provide a comprehensive solution by targeting specific tax regimes. The risks associated with closing one aggressive tax regime is that ultra-high net worth individuals may be able to adopt other regimes offering broadly similar benefits. This is why the most effective approach involves a minimum standard expressed as a fraction of a base hard to manipulate. At the top of the wealth distribution, this base is wealth itself. So you see that they're saying that going after holding companies or any individual scheme might be desirable, but it's whack-a-mole. They'll do something else. Okay, fair enough. Another option to improve the effectiveness of taxation of these individuals involves increasing progressivity of the individual income tax. Figure 9 considers how such a reform would affect tax progressivity in high-income countries. Specifically, I consider an effect of a 50% increase in the effective income tax rate of centimillionaires. This increase could be implemented either through an increase in statutory top marginal income tax rates or through improved enforcement. As the figure shows, such a reform would make a significant difference for centimillionaires rather than billionaires. For that group, it would be broadly equivalent to implementing the 2% minimum standard presented in this blueprint. However, this reform would make little difference for billionaires. That is because the billionaires have little taxable income and as a result pay little income tax. Okay, so increasing their income tax by 50% would make little difference to their tax liability. That is because somebody asked about what makes billionaires different. And obviously the exact number is arbitrary if you want to get into it, but that is interesting that even centimillionaires are more accessible via income tax than billionaires. Billionaires hold a lot of their wealth, and so you have to tax that wealth if you want to get to them. That's a very interesting distinction. I mean, it is a bit of a why not both situation, but yeah. A more progressive inheritance tax. Last, Figure 10 considers the effect of more effective taxation of intergenerational wealth transmissions. Specifically, I consider the effect of implementing a well-enforced 40% estate tax on the wealth of centimillionaires. Existing estate and inheritance taxes have multiple loopholes which in effect shield a significant fraction of the largest estates from taxation. In the scenario considered in Figure 10, by contrast, the estate tax would be well enforced, with all assets valued at their market value and no deductions or exemptions. I mean, I wouldn't... I don't know. I would never have thought an inheritance tax would help that much. Because that's just on a very specific passing down of the wealth. I mean, inheritance is income, not wealth, if you get me. It comes from wealth, but it's income. Even a well-enforced estate tax 40% make little difference yet. See that, the yellow one. This is because the estate tax is levied only once at the time of death, thus generates significantly less revenue than annual taxes, given observed mortality rates for ultra-high net worth individuals. Is that like a really sort of dry joke? A wry joke, I'd say, about billionaires trying not to age. Hey, you guys being mean to each other. Stop it, or I'll implement a very high tax on all of your posting. Like with any change in conclusion, towards a more sustainable globalization. It's interesting that he mentions globalization quite a few times. He thinks that that's one of the main sources of this wealth inequality, but I don't know. It's one of them. Like with any change in taxation, the proposal made here would have costs and benefits. On the benefit side, a minimum tax on ultra-high net worth individuals would raise significant amounts of government revenue. These resources could be invested to support sustained economic development through investments in education, health, public infrastructure, the energy transition, and climate change mitigation, increasing long-run economic prosperity. Beyond the revenue gains for governments, the common standard detailed here would fix a key failure of contemporary tax systems which allow the wealthiest individuals to have relatively low effective tax rates. There would be benefits in terms of increased social trust and cohesion. There is a lot that countries can do unilaterally to improve the effectiveness of their system of taxation at the top of the wealth distribution. Coordinated action adds value, however, because it would reduce the risk of a race to the bottom and support domestic progressive tax measures. As for Pillar 2, global cooperation would help address the unequal effects of globalization, from which billionaires have benefited disproportionately as their businesses reaped the rewards of ever more integrated global markets. Like Pillar 2, the common standard proposed in this blueprint could be implemented through domestic measures rather than a multilateral treaty. It could be construed as a voluntary regime with built-in incentives to join. I do think this is clever. Wait, is Pillar 2 just the minimum tax on multinational companies is Pillar 2? Oh, okay. Mate, what's Pillar 1? Why are they calling it Pillar 2? What's Pillar 1? Pillar 1 consists of two main elements, Amount A and Amount B. This is reading policy documents, guys. This is what happens. So this is about the same thing. Taxation of multinationals, effectively. But I don't have time to read it now. And it's possibly even more boring than this report. No, the paper isn't a sequel. Pillar 2 and Pillar 1 are the tax regimes. But this discusses Pillar 2 solely. Pardon me. This blueprint did not discuss how the revenues from such a global standard should be spent. Government spending, like taxation, must be decided through democratic deliberation and the vote. There is a variety of legitimate uses of the revenues, including cutting taxes on highly taxed economic actors, funding domestic public goods and services, or contribute to global public goods. These issues will deserve a thorough and inclusive global discussion. Stop saying that. So many policy documents have this in. We must ensure that all stakeholders come to the table and have their views heard. Thanks to recent progress in international tax cooperation, a common max taxation standard for billionaires has become technically possible. Implementing it is a question of political will. Some actions can be taken immediately by individual countries, such as strengthening rules to limit tax-driven mobility. Countries can also start to examine what would be the most appropriate way to translate the standard described here in their own domestic legislation. Other actions require international coordination. At the international level, work should start to improve cross-border information exchange, most importantly by enhancing the country-by-country reports of multinational firms with information on beneficial owners. Multilateral work should also start to draft rules which should be modelled on the under-tax payments rules included in Pillar 2, including the standard proposal here would be effective, ensuring the standard proposal here would be effective even with less than full participation. The involvement of the G20 and other international forums and organisations will be essential. Like I just said. Always. We must continue to debate and discuss these proposals. We must involve all organisations. There must be a thorough legal, political, economic and social vetting of the above. All right. Elected officials. I mean, elected officials shouldn't be allowed to, I don't know, they shouldn't be allowed to have jobs in the private sector or anything for like 5 years or 10 years. Um, so yeah, I think this is. I mean, we didn't read all of it, but if you want a little summary of what I've seen, the ultra wealthy, as in billionaires, and centimillionaires, pay quite low rates of tax on average on their total income. For billionaires, they tend to avoid any type of income tax by just like reinvesting their wealth and living based on their wealth, based on like lines of credit and using their wealth as collateral and growing their companies. Therefore, they can't really be reached with income taxes. You need a wealth tax or some kind of wealth tax, whether that's in kind or financial. Centimillionaires can be reached with both because more of their income, more of their earnings are income, if that makes sense. Maybe the other way around, but you know what I mean. And yeah, they're looking at like a 1 to 3% annual taxation on the estimated wealth of these individuals. There are a number of problems with estimating wealth, but quite a lot of progress has been made in tracking this, and there are methods available for doing this. How good those actually are, especially when the companies are private, not public, I don't know. I wasn't completely convinced by that section. In terms of like international mobility, it's overstated. You can do multiple things like tax based on citizenship, have exit taxes, have legacy taxes that try to address this. There are quite a lot of promising systems in place and progress on this front that haven't been visible to the average person. The amount of revenue it would raise, although we didn't cover that bit, I know it's not that big. But you can make the tax system at least not regressive anymore through this, which is good for like inequality and social cohesion. And it will raise some revenue, just not that much. But yeah. All right. I think I'll probably do a part 3 because there are these 2 other papers, Taxing Our Wealth, Taxing the Wealthy. Thanks to whoever recommended those at the start. Maybe I'll do another one. There was also a podcast I kind of wanted to listen to and react to about someone who is against wealth taxation because I want to see now, because I didn't really know anything about wealth taxes going into all this, like before part 1. And now I'm like, I want to see like, if I listen to an expert who's against wealth taxes, are they making points I haven't heard before? Or is it like, are they making sort of some of the same silly points that a lot of people have been making? Anyway, let's... yeah, thanks for sticking with me for a very boring policy paper.
Would capital controls help to curb tax evasion?
So, capital controls. Yes. Because if you are, when you evade tax, you're moving your capital. So in principle, they could do. I think the issue is that capital controls are quite a blunt tool, let's say. So they target every movement of capital, or most movements of capital, rather than just for the purposes of avoiding taxation. I guess something like exit taxes is like better targeted than capital controls. Not that I'm against capital controls, but that's like a lot of financial market activity you're preventing then. And also, that only helps with international tax evasion, doesn't it? It doesn't help with domestic tax evasion and various tools that the wealthy use to avoid taxes in their own country. So I think while it would probably help with international mobility of the wealthy, I think there are other ways of achieving the same aim. And capital controls are they're more to prevent capital flight, I think, and volatility and investment in financial markets. I think they're a different tool. There's some overlap, but they're a different tool. Good question. Thank you for the super chat. And that will be it. I've got to go. I'm going out with my friends. I have friends. Read it and weep. Read it and weep.